Hello and welcome back to a brand new episode of my true crime podcast, The True Crime Cocktail Hour. Welcome, welcome. My name is Holly, and after this exhausting week of work, I think it is time for a little after-work cocktail. So you sit back and relax. I'll be mixing as a cocktail called Daddy's Passion. And what I do, I will also tell you the story of a mysterious true crime case. So today I will be telling you all about the crime case of Germany of the year 2006. This case took place in Munich back then, and it is often referred to as a perfect murder, even though there's been a conviction. So get ready for mystery, secret, family conflicts, lies, and a massive inheritance. So let's not lose any more time. I'll get everything ready, and then we will open up case file number 107, the park garage murder. So just a heads up, today's case is very, very complex. So we'll just be scratching the surface today, but don't worry, you will still have a good understanding of the case and what happened. You know, I could tell you all about it, but honestly, we would still be here tomorrow, and Mommy's got a nail appointment. Okay, you ready? Okay, so let me start off this case by introducing you to this lady over here. This is Charlotte Böhringer. Charlotte Böhringer was born in 1947 in Hungary, 60 miles south of Budapest, but she and the rest of her family emigrated to Germany when she was still very young. Now, Charlotte was very, very ambitious. She wanted to make something of herself. So she learned the language quite fast. She also learned everything about style. She was very charming. And there was just something about her. So as a young woman, she met her future husband, Oskar Böhringer. Oskar Böhringer was 28 years older than Charlotte, and he was a construction entrepreneur. So over the course of his career, he built this massive fortune, owning several properties, including a very large and very lucrative park garage with an adjoining gas station in the heart of Munich. Now, because of this age difference, it might have not come as that big of a surprise that he would pass before her. But when he actually did in 1995, Charlotte still wasn't really prepared for it. I mean, you know how it is. Now, here's the kicker, though. He left her everything. All the properties, including the gas station, the park garage, and his entire fortune of $55 million. Okay, now, fast forward to 2006. Charlotte is now a wealthy widow, a member of Munich's high society, and the managing director of the parking garage. She also lives in the parking garage. On the very top level, above the final parking deck, is her luxurious apartment. Over 4,000 square feet with this massive rooftop terrace and a spectacular view over the city of Munich. Now, only her closest relatives know about the existence of this apartment, and even if you were standing on the top parking level, you would never guess that there is a private residence there, because the door to her apartment looked exactly like all the others, just a plain yellow steel door, just like every door in this parking garage. And try to remember this because this little detail is going to be important later on. So Charlotte has many acquaintances due to her status, but she unfortunately only has very, very few good friends. And look, I don't know if that's the reason, but according to her employees, her family members and friends, Charlotte Böhringer was difficult. Look, I'm sure this woman had many positive traits, but I mean, I did my research, and unfortunately, not a lot of people had a lot of good things to say about her. A lot of the time, she was described as hot-tempered, possessive, very condescending, and I quote, sometimes not nice, and sometimes even less nice. Also, ever since her husband died, Charlotte Böhringer became very suspicious of the people around her. Like, it is said that she was kind of overwhelmed with the sudden fortune and handling the parking garage and the gas station and everything. It was also said that she became very paranoid, like, what's your intention really, you know? She always thought like somebody was behind her money or cheating on her or taking advantage of her, you know? Maybe that's why she never remarried. And she also never had kids of her own. So Charlotte, eventually, as she got older, she sat there and she was like, well, what's going to happen to now my fortune and the parking garage and the gas station? Who's going to take care of it after I die? But to all of these questions, there was actually only one answer. Her two beloved nephews were to inherit everything. So the oldest one is Benedict Todt. He was 30 or 31 in 2006. And his youngest brother's name is Mate. I know it's written like the word mate, but in Europe you say Mate. It's a very unusual name. Apparently it's a short Hungarian version of the name Matteo, just so you know. So in the event of her death, the fortune was to be split evenly between the nephews. The parking garage and the gas station, however, was to go exclusively to the older one, Benedict, who was also supposed to run it. In case you've been wondering, Benedict was her favorite nephew. But there was one condition. Look, Benedict would only be officially named as heir and owner of the parking garage and the gas station if he successfully completed law school. Because according to Charlotte, otherwise he wouldn't be able to handle all the financial and business responsibilities. So Benedict, being the good nephew that he is, started to go to law school, but he and his brother Mate also worked at the gas station and the parking garage. Mate worked there full-time. Benedict only worked part-time because he was still going to law school, and he worked there for approximately a little bit over $1,000 a month, which is not that much to live on. But, you know, I mean, the tuition and his cars and all of his other expenses were covered by his Aunt Charlotte anyway. And that brings us to May the 17th, 2006. So at some point during the day, Benedict started his shift at the parking garage. And the employees there just told him that they hadn't seen his Aunt Charlotte all day. Now, Benedict, he was working, he was doing what he was supposed to do. But then there were these accountant issues that he needed her help with. So he called her on her cell phone, but she did not pick up. And that was unusual. And she also did not pick up the phone when he tried to call her again and again. So Benedict at some point went down to his brother Mate and he told him all about it. And Mate was like, okay, that's weird. So you stay here, try and call her. I will walk up to her apartment and check. So Mate, he walks upstairs to her apartment. Benedict is downstairs trying to reach her on her telephone. And when Mate was standing right in front of this yellow steel door, he could hear the ringing of the phone behind the steel door. Still, Aunt Charlotte would not answer her phone. So this is when Benedict began to feel a little bit uneasy, and he called the deputy manager of the parking garage, who has a spare key to Charlotte's apartment. So he called him up, hey, can you come by, bring the spare key? The deputy manager does. He arrives at the gas station, and together with Benedict, they go up to Aunt Charlotte's apartment. So once you open up this yellow steel door, you are not immediately in the apartment. You first enter a small hallway where on the left, a marble staircase leads up to the actual apartment. And right there, in that small hallway, they found Charlotte Böhringer lying face down on the floor, her head turned aside, covered in blood. There was blood everywhere. Her skull was smashed in, and she was obviously beaten to death very brutally. So Benedict, he walks up to Charlotte in a panic, and he's trying to feel for her pulse, but she's already cold. And this is when he runs out and he throws up into the next trash bin. Now, the murderer had been in Charlotte's apartment after the murder. So he murdered her and then went up this marble staircase. Yet, a robbery gone wrong was ruled out. Yes, the apartment had been searched and there were papers lying all over the floor in Charlotte's office, but all the valuables were still there, you know. Nothing was stolen. Also, the safe even still had the keys in it, but it had not been emptied. So it appeared that Charlotte Böhringer was attacked when she was just walking through the yellow steel door, likely to go to her Monday night social gathering. So that means her murderer must have known about her apartment, must have known about her daily routines, and did not have a key to her apartment. So autopsy revealed that Charlotte Böhringer was killed by 24 blows to the head. The murder weapon, however, was never found. The murderer took that with him. Her time of death was determined to be between 19 and 19:10 p.m. on May the 16th, 2006, which, yes, is a surprisingly precise window, but they were actually able to nail that down. Stomach contents? Check. Her body temperature, but also her phone data. And that was the most important clue about her time of death, because the phone data showed that she was talking to someone on the phone a couple of minutes before she was murdered. But then shortly after 7:10 p.m., she was called again by somebody, I don't know, and she already did not pick up her phone. So this is why investigators were able to say, okay, this is a time frame, this is something we can work with. And due to the brutality of the crime and the crime scene itself, investigators quickly assumed that the motive was personal and that the killer knew his victim, and vice versa. Now, before we jump headfirst into the investigation, there is someone else I want to introduce you to, because the chief investigator in this case was not just anybody. You know, there's not a lot of murders in Munich, especially in high society with massive media attention. But if something like that does happen, he is in charge. This is homicide detective and head of the Munich murder division, Joseph Wilfling. He is considered, I should rather say he was considered, because he unfortunately died 4 years ago, but he was considered a criminal investigation prodigy. He had a success rate this close to 100%, okay? He is the closest to Sherlock Holmes Germany has to offer. And he was said to be an exceptional judge of character and an interrogation expert. So while I shake, you can watch this interview with him, so you get an idea of what he was like.
Herzlich willkommen, Joseph Wilfling. Herr Wilfling, grüß Gott, herzlich willkommen, bitteschön. Es kann jeder zum Mörder werden.
Nach meiner Auffassung schon, ja. Also jetzt nicht unbedingt vielleicht zum Mörder oder zum Raubmörder, das würde ich jetzt Ihnen nicht zutrauen.
Ja, was würden Sie mir zutrauen?
Lustmörder auch nicht.
Was ist das häufigste Motiv, das Ihnen begegnet ist?
Also Habgier ist sicherlich das häufigste Motiv. Man muss differenzieren zwischen den rationalen Motiven und den emotionalen.
But you know, every investigator has this one case that hangs over him or her like a dark cloud. And in the case of Joseph Wilfling, that was the parking garage murder. And you are about to learn why. So naturally, the first people investigators questioned were Charlotte's closest relatives. In this case, her nephews, Mate and Benedict. Now, Mate didn't really have a lot of useful information. He also had a rock-solid alibi. On the day of the murder, he had started his late shift at 5 p.m., so 2 hours before the murder, and he had been under video surveillance throughout his entire shift. The only thing he could tell investigators was that the employees from the early shift told him that they hadn't seen his Aunt Charlotte all day. And that brings us to the favorite nephew, Benedict. He seemed to be deeply affected by the murder of his Aunt Charlotte, but his statements to the police also raised a lot of suspicion. For example, Benedict said that he was at home with the flu the night of the murder. His fiancée, Rebecca, however, said that he was at her apartment. And also, employees of the gas station and the parking garage would later tell police that the very next day, the day after the murder, Benedict showed up at the gas station healthy and so energetic. So someone is lying. And bottom line, he doesn't have a solid alibi. He gave unusually precise times for his activities that day. He knew about the apartment. He knew about her routines. And notably, none of the 1,000 cameras in this parking garage captured the murderer. and there was a lot of cameras. The entire parking garage structure was monitored, except the door of a small rear entrance. Now, you could only open this door from the outside with a key, but from the inside, it was enough to wedge a small stone between the door and the door frame. The murderer must have known that. And Benedict had a strong motive. Now, you probably think, well, yeah, the inheritance. And you're right, but there's much more to this story. Joseph Wilfling and his team discovered that the relationship between aunt and nephew had become increasingly tense in the weeks leading up to the murder. So you remember that Benedict was supposed to successfully complete law school if he wanted to inherit Aunt Charlotte's money, right? And in the weeks leading up to the murder, it seemed he had done just that, successfully completing his law degree. He even had his best friend pick him up from the university on the last day of his final exam, which is like a German student's tradition, I think. And then he also invited all of the employees from the parking garage and the gas station for breakfast to celebrate his law degree. The truth, however, was very, very different. Benedict over here never finished his law degree. It was all a lie. Listen, when his aunt Charlotte first came up to him and told him, hey, I want you to have a law degree, he initially gave it a shot. He went to law school and he even passed the first major exam. But in reality, Benedict hates every second of it. And he would rather become an actor. So he drops out of law school, enrolls in theatrical sciences, drops out again, applies for acting school, gets rejected, and then goes back to law school again, and eventually dropping out again. All the while, he's telling his Aunt Charlotte that he's still studying law. Around the same time, Charlotte Böhringer noticed that money was missing from the cash box of the garage's office. Now listen, she had no concrete proof that Benedict took the money, but suspicion was enough for her to take away his keys and instruct all of her employees to never let Benedict into that office alone again. So Benedict didn't have a key anymore, right? Which is precisely the reason Charlotte hired this deputy manager in the first place and gave him the spare key for the parking garage and her apartment. And this is why Benedict had to call the deputy manager when he wanted to check on his Aunt Charlotte, because he doesn't have a key anymore. The deputy manager has one. So all in all, Charlotte had demoted her once favorite nephew to a subordinate employee while still trying to control every aspect of his life. So in the weeks leading up to the murder, Charlotte spoke increasingly poorly about her nephew Benedict. She openly opposed his engagement with Rebecca because she didn't trust the woman, because she just wants the money and blah, blah. She took away his keys, and sooner or later she would, or maybe she already had discovered, that Benedict had lied to her all this time about going to law school. So, as investigators found out, 2 weeks before the murder, there was this massive argument between Charlotte and her nephew Benedict that ended with Benedict shouting at his aunt, "Kiss my ass." And so, 3 days after the murder, Benedict was arrested and charged with the murder of his aunt. The trial was a media spectacle. Benedict in court sometimes seemed quite aggressive and sometimes very detached. What was also noticeable was the fact that he did not hide behind folders or anything. He stared directly into the camera. He also had lost a significant amount of weight after having gone on a hunger strike. And he vehemently maintained his innocence. He swore up and down that he had nothing to do with the murder of his aunt. Now here's the deal, the trial and the case were purely circumstantial. There was no proof for or against his guilt. Everything was circumstantial. Now, you may have heard about a chain of circumstantial evidence. In this case, prosecutors presented a ring of circumstantial evidence. So what's the difference? Okay, so look, in a chain of circumstantial evidence, each piece of evidence builds upon the other. So if one crucial link breaks for whatever reason, the entire chain can lose its strength. So for example, the suspect had no alibi. He had a motive. He had access to the crime scene. He was seen nearby, right? In a ring of circumstantial evidence, each piece of evidence stands for itself. They don't depend on one another. Instead, they build an overall picture that does not prove guilt, yet makes it seem highly likely. And in Benedict's case, prosecutors presented 14 different circumstantial indicators. Now we're just going to take a look at a few of them, the most important ones, and this is when you will also see why this case and the trial was so difficult and why people say it's the perfect murder. Because all of these circumstantial indicators are very, very strong, but can be explained in this way or another, left and right, doesn't matter. So let's take a look at circumstantial evidence number 14, right-handed versus left-handed. So according to the prosecution, the killer must be right-handed. Benedict, however, is left-handed. Now, you would normally think this would rule him out as a suspect. The thing is that the yellow steel door opens up to the left. So according to the prosecution, Benedict had to use his left hand to hold open the door when Charlotte opened it from the other side and then struck her with the right hand. And also, an expert witness testified in court that Benedict, although he favored his left hand, his grip strength was nearly equal in both hands. Circumstantial evidence number 6, the newspapers. Every morning, Charlotte had one of the employees of the gas station put 3 different newspapers in a plastic bag and bring it up to her apartment. And one of these newspapers had like a little local district section that did not cover the area where Benedict lived. Yet, such a newspaper, same date, same edition with the local district section and everything, was later found in Benedict's apartment. Benedict claimed he had borrowed it from the gas station. However, an inventory check showed that only one newspaper was missing, and that was the one the employee took for his aunt Charlotte. It was also proven that Charlotte herself had brought in these newspapers into her apartment earlier that morning. So what's he doing with the newspaper? Where did he get it from? You know? And last but not least, circumstantial evidence number 7, Benedict's DNA was found in Charlotte's office in the apartment, especially on an envelope containing her will and on a clear plastic sheet that was lying on the floor. Suspicious, yes, but not definitive. There was no way to prove how old that DNA was. And so, after 93 days of trial, the jury announced the verdict. Benedict Todt was found guilty of murder committed with treachery and greed. He was sentenced to life in prison. That means a minimum of 15 years. And let me tell you, when they read that verdict, chaos erupted in the courtroom because, apart from the journalists, there were only supporters of Benedict Todt in the courtroom, his friends, family, and whatnot, and people lost their shit. There was screaming. His fiancée broke down in tears. Benedict himself, he jumped up and he started screaming, and he was so full of rage, he had to be restrained. One of his attorneys, he just stood up and he just walked out of that courtroom in silent protest. It was wild. And as you can imagine, the defense refused to give up, but to no avail. They filed an appeal, rejected. They filed another appeal, also rejected. This whole thing went on and repeated itself over and over until this case was eventually brought in front of the European Court of Justice, highest instance. But even there, the verdict was upheld. So Benedict Todt ended up serving 17 years in prison, and he was released in 2023. I gotta say, Benedict Todt, he speaks very openly about the case and the trial and his conviction. He still maintains his innocence, and to this day, together with his attorney, he fights for a retrial. Whether he can prove his innocence is unclear, maybe even impossible, but among legal experts and a lot of journalists who have studied this case closely, there is now broad agreement on one thing. Based on the circumstantial evidence presented in trial, Benedict Todt should have never been convicted. The principle should have applied: when in doubt, rule in favor of the accused. And Chief Investigator Joseph Wilfling, you remember, has also come under a lot of criticism. Some accuse him of believing in his own infallibility, saying that he's spoiled by past successes and overly confident in his abilities. As a matter of fact, investigators never truly pursued alternative suspects. And so, despite the conviction, the murder of Charlotte Böhringer remains a mystery. And with that, we close case file number 107, the parking garage murder. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, subscribe, comment, give this video a thumbs up, all of that. And yeah, if you don't have any plans, Friday in 2 weeks, I hope you will join me again for another cocktail and obviously another mysterious true crime case. Maybe we'll go to Dallas, Texas for our next episode. I don't know yet. But in the meantime, don't forget, next Friday, there will be episode 3 of my new audio podcast, House of Jack and Jeffrey. Incredible story, so you don't want to miss that. And other than that, have a lovely weekend. Try to relax a little bit. Thank you for joining me today. Kiss. Mwah. And I'll see you then. Bye.